Guild Wars, Sea of Sorrows. Chapter 26. People were shouting. Soldiers bellowed commands, and the bells at the docks were ringing and clattering in cacophonous noise. Kobaya's eyes flew open. He was in the large, half-empty bed at his manor house, and darkness still surrounded him. The night was still late then, not yet morning. For a moment, Kobaya's mind was still tangled in a dream. He was on the Indomitable, surrounded by the still-moving corpses of drowned friends. In a panic, he rolled over and reached to grasp the sword that lay on the ground, tangled in his pants belt, but his hand fell instead upon a limp rag doll. Paula. In a moment of curious pause, Kobaya lifted it, tucking the faded yellow curls behind her shoulders. Then the world shifted into focus around him. The city's alarm bells were ringing, and a heavy smell of smoke filled the air. Quickly, Kobaya set the doll down and snatched up his coat and sword. He rolled out of bed and landed with his feet in his boots. The shouts were coming from the docks, and by the sound of it, trouble was already so far along that half the city was running about in the night. Kobaya rushed to the balcony door, throwing open the curtains and stepping out onto the half-circle veranda that looked out over the inner harbor and the gangplank bridge. Black smoke hung thickly in the air, covering everything with a layer of fog. Leon Guard, both in and out of armor, raced through the streets, carrying buckets of water. Kobaya lifted his head and followed them with his eyes as they headed west, toward. The docks were on fire. Massive flames leapt from ship to ship at Masha's Landing, encompassing the levees all the way down to White Crane Terrace. Across the bay, the city's main portage area was flaring up in brilliant shades of orange and red. A sudden explosion rocked the gangplank bridge as a char frigate on the docks went up like a firecracker, armaments exploding with a blinding flash of white light. Sailors scurried like ants, desperate to stop the flames before they could spread farther, but more than 3/4 of the ships at dock were already suffering damage from the blaze. Without thinking, Kobaya leapt over the balcony rail, climbed down the tiered roof, and dropped to the street below. "Commodore!" The shout came from a slender figure in the grand piazza. Through the haze, Kobaya recognized Benedict, the messenger lad. He was carrying an armload of empty buckets back along the fire brigade line. "What's happened?" Kobaya grabbed half of the youth's load and ran with him toward the water, where other citizens were filling them with sea and sand to douse oily areas of the blaze. Gamina said it was Creighton's. She was on watch at the docks and saw 4 men dressed in black setting fire to fuses. They hurled the bombs into the portholes of our munitions ships, the ones we were readying for an attack on the blockade. I heard her yelling right before they exploded. Benedict dropped the buckets on the sandbar and tried to wipe smoke from his eyes. She called the Lion Guard, but the men ran across the gangplank, and we lost sight of them. The Nomad, too, had sailed back out into the Sea of Sorrows 4 days ago, and Prince Adair's ships had blocked all passage into or out of the city's harbor. Clearly, the impatient prince wasn't going to just sit by and wait while the city readied a defense. Did Gamina see their faces? Yeah. Benedict brightened. She said she saw them real well by the light of the first fires. She went across the gangplank to the portage, in case they had a rowboat there. Clever girl. She'll need our help. Come with me. We'll go see if we can lend her a hand. Aye, sir. Benedict saluted. Yam stood on the long slope that led up to the gangplank, standing in the shelter of one of the massive seahorse arches. The Asura rocked back and forth on his feet, rubbing his ears in distress as he stared down at the fire. "Oh, Kobaya, what are we going to do?" he whimpered. "We'll keep fighting," Kobaya said. "I wrote to Radha Sum. I wrote the Arcane Council. I wrote every genius-level Asura I knew, even the bad ones. Surely someone will help us." Covered in soot, his ornate robes blackened by smoke and wet with seawater, Yam looked like a drenched cat. There's got to be a way. Over the years, Yam had become an excellent quartermaster for the city. When he'd been told that the harbor was going to be blockaded, the shopkeep captain immediately created a detailed system for organizing what food was left in Lion's Arch, apportioning it, and ensuring it would last as long as possible. Kobaya paused to pat Yam gently on the shoulder, wondering how Asaran parents consoled their children. Probably by giving them crystal wands and mechanical widgets to chew on. There, Yam, Kobaya said awkwardly. It'll be all right. Will it? Can you fix the gate? Turn it back on? Kobaya sat up hopefully. No. I graduated from the College of Statics, Yam said, pressing a 3-fingered hand to either side of his forehead. If the gate had, say, fallen over, I could get it back up, build a house around it, and shore up the architectural supports so that even an Eden couldn't knock it over again. But I can't fix the etheric ambulation. You need a graduate of dynamics, and Captain Tarb's half senile. If you let him fix it, it'll start teleporting people's parts to random locations. Imagine it. Your head's in the Citadel, your feet are in Rada Sum, and your butt's all the way up north among the glaciers. Nobody wants that. Kobaya stared at him, alternating between bemused and annoyed. Go back to your shop, Yam, and take inventory. We've lost everything stored on the docks, and that means we'll have to start rationing. Yam clambered to his feet, still muttering. Fine, I can do that. The Asura grumbled and turned, slogging down the slope toward his shop in the Traders' Forum. Fix it, Yam, fix it. What does he think I am? Benedict grinned. Kobaya rolled his eyes and hurried across the wide wooden bridge. On the far side of the bridge was a massive plaza, larger than the main trade terraces in the city square. It was far less ornamented as well, covered with scuff marks, where the Lion Guard prepared for duty. Racks of weapons stood beneath shady awnings topped with gold flags, their edges blunted for use in training exercises. Kobaya was passing the archery range when Gamina stepped out of the shadows, her snub nose, an impish smile far more suited to meadows than murder. Benedict said you were tracking the saboteurs? Kobaya asked, trying not to look too surprised by her sudden appearance. He was good at stealth, or had been in his youth. She was better. Keep your voice down, Commodore, she warned him. I doubt they've gone far. When Captain Tarb had retired, the pixie-like blonde had left the old Asura's service and joined the Lion Guard. Braun, now the captain of the guard, praised her to the skies. He even kept trying to give her command of one of the major travelers' havens, but Gamina always refused. She rarely accepted honors and often chose to work in the background. Kobaya had discovered the reason she preferred a low profile when Gamina approached him with an offer from the Order of Whispers, a legendary underground agency of spies, infiltrators, and scouts. If he gave her access to the captain's council not to vote, just to watch and stay informed, she and her fellows would keep him apprised of activity happening in the underbelly of the city. He'd agreed. Since then, Gamina had proven to be even more valuable, rooting out thieves, smuggling rings, and other dangers in the newly established city. Without the Order's aid, Lion's Arch might have fallen to any number of petty tyrants willing to trade the city's future for their own gain. They headed out toward the tugboat dock, she said quietly, pointing with the blade of her dagger. I haven't seen a boat leave. Unless they swam, they'll be down there. You can't swim out that far. They're still here, probably waiting until the area's clear before they try to make for the ships offshore. He glanced at Benedict. Can you wield a sword, Ben? Yes, sir. Benedict grinned. Kobaya gestured to the training weapons, and Benedict picked one up and strapped it to his waist. Might not be very sharp, sir, but it'll do, Gamina murmured. That char ship dropped a bellyful of oil when she went up in flames. It's spread across the harbor, and most of it's alight. The Critons can't row out right now, or they'll be seen. The city's bombard guns would make short work of them. She gestured lightly toward the gun emplacements on the cliffs. Keep to the shadows and stay quiet. Kobaya and Benedict followed her into the shadows of the tugboat docks as Gamina continued. The Order got word that the Cretans might try something like this, but we had no timetable. We thought Prince Adair would wait at least a week before he tried to torch the docks. She glanced back at Kobaya. You must have really gotten on his bad side. He scowled and didn't answer. They moved from building to building, peering through windows and checking doors for any sign of forced entry. Gamina's slippered feet passed silently over the cobblestones, leaving Kobaya and Benedict to scurry behind like hounds in the wake of an alley cat. Once again, Kobaya blessed his childhood on the streets. If he hadn't learned thiefcraft, it would have been incredibly difficult to keep up. It's not surprising that Adair's overreacting, Gamina murmured. Even his father was afraid of you. Didn't you wonder why Bade never tried to take Lion's Arch? I assumed he didn't care for the climate, Kobaya joked. No dice, she chuckled. He didn't have the guts to take on the finest navy in the world or their commander. Gamina glanced back at him. Taking this city by force requires an attacker to be ruthless. You'd have to destroy the navy and slaughter the populace before they'd kneel to a ruler who's not born and bred in the waves. Which ruins the point of taking the city in the first place, Benedict surmised. Isn't that right? Gamina nodded. Bade respected that and tried to deal with you, hoping Lion's Arch would return to Creata in time. Adair doesn't care. He's not that patient. Remember that, Kobaya? And remember that pride is Adair's weakness. Remember? Kobaya peered out past the edge of one of the buildings on the wharf, ensuring that the way ahead was clear. Gamina, I'm not exactly planning to have tea with the pox-faced Prince of Creata. You might not be planning it, but I can assure you he is. Suddenly, Gamina dropped to a crouch and scooted behind a pile of cargo. Look over there. She pointed toward the other side of the wharf. Kobaya and Benedict scrambled to either side of her and peered down through cracks between the cargo crates for several minutes, looking quizzical. Growing impatient, Gamina pushed Kobaya forward, indicating the slope that led beneath the pier. You go that way and get their attention. I'll come up behind them. Moving silently, she glided around the far corner of the cargo pile and vanished into the night. Kobaya and Benedict shared a glance. Do you see them? Kobaya asked. Benedict shrugged and shook his head. Kobaya sighed. Me neither. Awkwardly, Benedict drew the longsword he had gathered from the training ground, holding the weapon as if it were a club. Kobaya frowned in concern, but there was very little he could do about it. Hopefully, Benedict was better in action than he looked standing still. Kobaya drew his cutlass and gestured for the youth to follow him down the slope. You can't use a sword at all, can you? Kobaya asked. Benedict shook his head sheepishly, and Kobaya sighed. All right. Stay close. As they approached, Kobaya slowly began to make out 4 men beneath the pier, all huddled around a rowboat hidden beneath the shadow of the farthest dock. They'd been talking in low tones, voices barely audible over the hush and swell of the ocean waves, but Kobaya saw one of them gesture quickly, pulling his fist close to his face in warning. The others instantly fell silent. In the light of the oil fires scattered over the water of the harbor, Kobaya saw that 2 of the men were holding daggers. A third pulled a thick-handled mallet from his belt. Looking inquisitively at the 4th, he tapped the heavy workhammer in his hand the way a tree cutter might swing his axe. The 4th moved around the rowboat, peering in Kobaya's direction. Kobaya reached back and gripped Benedict's hand, making sure the boy wasn't moving. Both groups stood in silence for a moment, and then the 4th bandit scowled. He'd seen them. Raising his voice in the tongue of magic, the 4th bandit pulled a strange-looking dagger from his belt. The blade was twisted like an animal's horn, and the hilt was embellished with blue stone. The man cast a quick spell, and a claw-like burst of fire shot forward from his weapon. The talons raked Kobaya's flesh, searing his skin and, more important, showing exactly where he was standing. "Get them," the saboteur elementalist demanded. "Don't let them flee." "Flee?" Kobaya said, challenging them. "Hadn't even crossed my mind." He charged directly into the group, hoping to scatter them. One-on-one, Benedict might have a better chance against the Critons, and it would give Gamina an opportunity to do whatever she was planning. The elementalist skittered aside, and the two dagger-wielding thieves darted in opposite directions, planning to flank Kobaya and Benedict. The scruffy-looking man with the mallet blocked Kobaya's cutlass with the hilt of his weapon, a surprised oomph of effort escaping him. Kobaya smiled as his sharpened cutlass bit deep into the wood. Surprised at his opponent's skill, the ruffian scowled. The warrior spun the hammer, and where Kobaya's blade was stuck in the wood, the metal of the cutlass shrieked, bent, and then shattered. "The old geezer's all yours, boys," the scruffy thief said mockingly, a little bit of a breather, "and he might have another solid hit left for you." The two dagger-wielding thugs approached Kobaya, one to either side. Benedict pressed forward, his back against Kobaya's back, and Kobaya could feel the youth shaking. As is, they were no match for these saboteurs. "Give me your sword," Kobaya ordered, reaching back to take it from his young friend. Benedict paused only a second before obeying. "But, sir, what am I supposed to fight with?" "Give me a minute. I'll get you a dagger." Kobaya shrugged off his coat and began to twirl it in one hand, slapping the ground in circles as he warded off the attacker on his left side. Before the two saboteurs could formulate another plan, Kobaya swung his sword viciously at one of the daggermen. The thug ducked, lunging in beneath the reach of Kobaya's weapon. The dagger cut through the fabric of Kobaya's coat with a vicious swipe, but the old captain was too quick for the steel to touch his flesh. He tugged the coat aside, nearly pulling the dagger out of his opponent's hand, and swung again. This time, he felt his sword scrape against the man's leg. A good blow, but hardly crippling. The bandit elementalist changed his footing and chanted another spell. This time, heaviness pressed in the air around Kobaya, weighing on his shoulders with a damp, cold pressure. Recognizing the spell from his time with Vera long ago, Kobaya reached back and thrust Benedict aside, jumping forward himself as a spike of ice coalesced above them both. It drove into the ground where the two men had been standing, showering the area around them in chunks of frozen snow. Using the distraction as an opportunity to attack, one of the other brigands thrust in with his dagger. But this time, Kobaya swirled his coat around it, fouling the blade. Letting the coat fall over the dagger, Kobaya grabbed his assailant's wrist through the fabric. He jerked forward and drove his other fist, still wrapped around the hilt of his borrowed sword, into the man's face. Kobaya struck once, twice, then a third time, following up with a knee into the thug's extended arm. There was a sharp crack, and the man fell with a howl, clutching a broken wrist. Kobaya scooped up the assailant's dagger and tossed it to Benedict. "Better?" The youth smiled. "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." He gripped the lighter weapon more assuredly than he had the sword. Clearly, the messenger's childhood had not been so different from Kobaya's own. Near the rowboat, the brigand with the mallet had been planning an attack of his own. He swung the hammer over his head to gain speed, and as his companion fell, the scruffy-looking warrior slammed it down. The earth and sand beneath the pier rumbled from the mighty force of the blow. An explosion of earth and rocks burst up in all directions, showering Kobaya and the rest with blinding sand. Emboldened by the dagger and farther from the epicenter of the explosion, Benedict yelled a reedy battle cry and dove past Kobaya. Ignoring the others, he drove his shoulder into the belly of the caster. The man had nearly finished another spell, the tide nearby swirling upward into a geyser, but Benedict's tackle knocked them both backward over the rowboat. The geyser popped like a bubble, drenching the rowboat, combatants and all, in salt water as Benedict and the caster fell into the rising tide. Benedict managed to stab the other man, scoring a solid hit to his shoulder with the knife. The blade snagged and tore out of Benedict's hand as the bandit screamed. The dagger fell into the tide as Benedict grappled with his enemy, rolling and kicking in the water beneath the pier. First an earthquake, then a downpour. Scratching at his eyes, Cobias stumbled as he tried to regain his balance on the still shifting sand. He could hear the other bandit cursing a few feet away. Reaching out for the dark form at the edge of his vision, Cobiah managed to grab the other man's head, tangling his fingers into the thug's hair. The man struck out with his knife. A white-hot flame ignited in a line along Cobiah's ribcage. He ignored the pain long enough to jerk the thug's head forward, cracking a fist into the man's nose. The thug yelped, his body going suddenly limp, and fell forward into the sand. Benedict twisted in the sand, fighting hand-to-hand with the bandit spellcaster. Thinking quickly, Benedict kicked the other man's dagger free, leaving both to fight purely with their hands. The elementalist quickly pulled out an offhand focus as he clutched Benedict's arms, his fingers sinking deep into the youth's flesh. Benedict countered with knee kicks to the body, and the two rolled in the shallow water. The elementalist shouted another spell. With a flash of light, his hands burst into flames. The spell was weaker than if he'd been using his dagger, and splashing water absorbed the worst of it. Benedict's flesh seared, blisters rising on his biceps where the elementalist squeezed. Aware that Benedict was in trouble, Cobiah pushed himself away from the two whimpering, injured bandits fallen in the sand at his feet. Intending to throw himself forward to join the fight, Cobiah raised his sword and lunged forward, but where he expected to fly to the boy's aid, his body suddenly refused to obey. A second wave of force from the scruffy-looking bandit's hammer knocked him back again, and Cobiah found himself stumbling, pushed aside as easily as a wave knocks away a bit of foam. He could hear his own opponent laughing, feet crunching in wet sand as the Creodan strode closer. The man with the hammer was a problem. Worse, his blow had shaken Cobiah's body, exacerbating the dagger wound. Cobiah put a hand to his side and drew it away, covered in blood. It burned from immersion in salt water and gritty sand, and Cobiah's breath came in short gasps. He was bleeding heavily, and being soaked in water only made the situation worse. Cobiah forced himself to stand. Benedict was screaming, the elementalist's fire flickering with ghostly flame up and down the youth's arms. "I'm coming," Cobiah managed to say, but he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "I didn't recognize you at first. You know," the scruffy bandit taunted. "I wouldn't have expected to meet the famous Commodore Mariner under a rough side pier." The man spun his heavy wooden mallet in his hands, giving Cobiah a snaggle-toothed grin. "You're nothing like the king's advisors described. They told us to be careful about you. Said that if the master of the city got involved, we'd be done for." His laugh of disdain echoed with Benedict's cries for help. "But here you are. Nothing more than a weak old man stumbling in the tide. Your legend is nothing but a waste of breath." The man with the hammer paused and eyed Cobiah up and down, taking in the blood-stained shirt, his faltering steps, and the sword hanging heavily in the Commodore's hand. "Prince Adair paid us a chest of gold to turn that fleet to ash. I bet he'll give us 10 times more if we bring back your head, Commodore." The warrior hefted his weapon again, the heavy mallet moving ponderously in his burly grip. Cobiah tried to raise his sword for another attack, but it was as if iron bands circled his chest, squeezing all the breath out of him. Where was Gamina? He glanced about but saw nothing in the shadows, nothing in the movement of the waves beyond the pier. As the bandit strode closer, Cobiah's thoughts flitted to Isaiah. Macha. Once more, he'd trusted someone, and they'd repaid him with treachery. Urgency spurred Cobiah forward. He had to get to Benedict before the saboteur elementalist burned the youth to death. Desperate, Kobaya chopped at the mallet-wielding brigand. The wound made his sword arm as slow as winter molasses, and the bandit dodged easily. Kobaya tried again, but the Creodan batted his weapon aside like a feather. "Just die, Commodore," the man said, grinning. "You're no hero. You're no great leader. You're nothing." The words were like a slap in the face. Nothing. He could hear his mother say, over and over again. "You're worth nothing." Rage swelled in Kobaya's heart. His vision blurred, turning red, and he ignored the pain to swing his sword with a far younger man's anger. Taken by surprise, the brigand stumbled backward, his hand loosening on the heavy mallet. Kobaya's second swing knocked it free, and the mallet tumbled to the ground. "Out of my way," Kobaya roared. His heart was pounding. Blood flowed between the fingers of the hand pressed to his ribcage. Clenching his other hand around the hilt of the sword, Kobaya shoved past the scruffy-looking bandit and ran toward Benedict. Raising his sword, Kobaya stabbed down at the elementalist and felt his weapon strike flesh. As the brigand screamed, Benedict raised his feet and kicked the other man in the chest, pushing him farther onto the weapon until, at last, the fire died, and the man's body went limp. Kobaya sagged, forced to let go of his sword as Benedict rolled out from under the dead man. "Are you all right?" Kobaya managed to ask. Benedict nodded gratefully, shoving the body off him and into the ocean waves. "Commodore," Benedict scrambled in the waves for his lost dagger. The seared flesh of his arms was blistered and raw, but he raised a hand to point over Kobaya's shoulder. Wide-eyed, he yelled, "Watch out!" Kobaya looked, knowing what he'd see. He'd been forced to leave the last bandit behind in order to get to Benedict before the messenger was burned to death. It had been a conscious choice, and he was prepared for the consequences. Behind him, the brigand with the mallet swung his weapon in a wide swath. Kobaya heard the whisper and crackle of magical force around the weapon's head. He had only time enough to spin around, placing himself between the injured Benedict and the brigand's strike as the massive bludgeon swept forward. But the hammer never landed. Behind the brigand, Gamina's blades flashed like lightning strikes. First one and then the other plunged deep into the thug's back. The bandit warrior staggered, hammer tilting forward and falling out of his hands as he collapsed to his knees. Gamina twisted her blades and jerked them out with a disdainful snarl. He fell lifeless to the ground. "Sorry, I'm late." Gamina smiled into Kobaya's slack-jawed stare. "There were 2 more up on the dock, and they slowed me down." "No problem. Looks like you were." "Just in time," Kobaya managed to say. Waves rolled up around his boots, splashing gently against the silver buckles and dark soles. Something struck him, some memory he couldn't quite place. Kobaya's knees gave out, and he fell, sitting in the tide. He felt Benedict's hand on his shoulder, saw the worried look on Gamina's features. But before Kobaya could ask what troubled them, everything went dark.